Hello, and welcome back to Trumpet World. We've reached the anniversary of October 7th and the terrorist attack that Hamas launched on Israel last year. Since then, a lot has changed in Israel, in the wider Middle East, and in the world as a whole. Where have we come in a year of terrorism, of war, of new alliances, and old partnerships breaking? For our first interview today, we have Tal-Or Cohen Montemayor, the founder and CEO of CyberWell, an Israeli company that analyzes content for anti-Semitism for worldwide for some of the biggest social media companies on the internet. Tal-Or, thank you for being here.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I was wondering if maybe you could just introduce with what your history is with CyberWell, what you do, everything that the organization was up to before October 7th.
CyberWell is the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism. We launched in May 2022, launching the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism to give a clear picture of the state of Jew hatred online, but with an added value of looking at that data through the lens of digital policy compliance. So looking at this from the perspective of how do we actually empower social media platforms to better enforce their own rules when it comes to online anti-Semitism. And I like to say that after our launch, our first kind of proof of concept was actually the Kanye West incident, which at the time was kind of the worst of our problems in online anti-Semitism, kind of celebrity-led online anti-Semitism, where we saw that incident trigger a significant spike in different anti-Semitic narratives online. And we were able to supply the social media platforms with real-time alerts on how this specific incident triggered different anti-Semitic trends on their platforms. So since that time, we've been onboarded as a trusted partner of major social media platforms, including Meta, covering Facebook and Instagram and Threads, and including TikTok as well. So what we're doing is not only giving real-time alerts to the state of online anti-Semitism, which has been, unfortunately, a hot flash issue in recent times, but we're also giving specific analysis on how the rules of the social media platforms can better be enforced.
With that, I take it most of that reputation was pretty solid before October of last year, that there was a lot of healthy back and forth dialogue, that there weren't, say, too many, conflicts of interest with the work that CyberWell was doing?
Well, the state of online anti-Semitism has been an issue for years, actually. The reason that I started CyberWell was because I was working in the business intelligence and open source intelligence space, and I saw a very clear migration of deeply anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and memes and images, but really hateful content from the dark corners of the internet to our mainstream everyday social media platforms. And the difference between these dark corners of the internet and the mainstream platforms is, of course, the audience. So the major social media platforms make up over half of the worldwide internet activity. And as a student of history and of the Holocaust, I saw this and was very much reminded of the way that mass media was mobilized to kind of broadcast anti-Semitism before the Holocaust happened during the Third Reich. There is no society that can participate in widespread violent anti-Semitism without being primed with that idea of the conspiracy theory of Jew hatred before that incident. And that's really how I saw the major social media platforms actually becoming at great risk for doing just that, for broadcasting online anti-Semitism for millions and millions of people. So I'm also a lawyer, and I kind of thought to myself, well, what if we took a technological solution and this added level of digital policy compliance and combined that into one? And that's how CyberWell started. Unfortunately, it was the right place and the right time, because since the launching of CyberWell, we've actually seen a tremendous increase in online anti-Semitism following October 7th, which I characterize as the most successful hijacking of our social media platforms by a terrorist group. CyberWell tracked an 86% increase almost a doubling in online anti-Semitism in the 3 weeks following the attack. And what was unique about the content that was flooding the online space at this time is that it was decidedly more violent. Calls to violence, including calls to young Muslims to come over the border into Israel and take up arms in order to kill as many Jews as possible. And this type of flood of anti Semitic content online is now being felt very much directly in the streets, in the communities that Jews live in public institutions. But more importantly, I don't think that we've had enough of a healthy conversation in terms of what is the role that social media plays in fueling this violence against our community. And we see that the level of violent anti Semitism is still higher now online than it was prior to October 7th. And more importantly, that the discourse has taken a more decidedly hostile turn against Jews online.
Yeah, so going back to October 7th, this is obviously when we're recording at the 1 year anniversary of the attack. Um, we have a much clearer picture now with different bits of information filtering in on what Hamas was planning on doing, what some of the uh, circumstances surrounding it are. As you mentioned, though, like in the weeks or the few days immediately afterwards, there's obviously a lot of people didn't really know what was going on, what all of this meant, and I'm sure this was reflected in some of the stuff that you guys were picking up. And how was Facebook and some of these other organizations, with all the unknowns going on, how did they respond to what people were saying, what they were allowing people to say, etc.?
So the issue with social media platforms, and I think that really 1 year after October 7th, we should take pause and think, what can we learn about our safety overall as Western democracies that have these very powerful algorithmically enhanced machines that were effectively hijacked by a terrorist group on by Hamas on October 7th. And what does that mean, right? Just like after 9/11 today, if you would go through any airport security, you know that you're removing your shoes, you're taking out your liquids from your bags. Why? Because we learned something on the day of that attack. And I don't feel like there's been the same kind of taking stock when it comes to the way that social media platforms can be used as a weapon of psychological warfare. What we saw on October 7th with the major social media platforms is that they were used as a weapon of terror by Hamas to broadcast deeply gory snuff, essentially, of their attack on the Israeli civilian population. This perpetuated the attack far beyond time and space, which is the element of using these social media platforms as a tool of psychological warfare. But then, very interestingly, CyberWell actually tracked an October 7th denial campaign that started as early as October 8th, as early as the next day, where you saw accounts that only had a few thousand followers, were located in the Middle East and places in Lebanon, tweeting out denial content that October 7th never happened or didn't happen quite the way that the news was reporting on it. And we saw those accounts suddenly being amplified and gaining millions and millions of views. In fact, in a 300-piece data set of content that CyberWell vetted as October 7th denial in the first month following the October 7th attack, that denial content reached 25 million people. So you're talking about the large platforming of a major disinformation campaign after one of the largest attacks on the Jews since the Holocaust. Now, think about what that could mean for any Western democracy today that's under the threat of a terrorist attack. And the FBI has come out with multiple statements saying that there is a higher level or a higher imminent risk of an ISIS attack in the United States now more than ever. I don't feel like there is a clear understanding of what are the safety precautions do we want to put on social media platforms in order to make sure that they don't become weapons of psychological warfare and misinformation and disinformation campaigns on the eve of a terror attack. Now, you asked about how the social media platforms reacted. It was exactly that. It was reactionary. It was temporary. Temporarily, there was a lot more effort in content moderation. Temporarily, they set up task force. But where are the takeaways? What are the best practices to ensure that a hijacking of our social media platforms never happens again? And I think that at this point, it's an issue of national security, and every Western government should be interested in what are the social media platforms doing in order to ensure it never happens again.
But with the reaction, as you were talking about, do you find at least the people that you're talking to, the people that are implementing maybe some of your recommendations, do you feel like they're sympathetic to what they're combating, or are they treating it as a non-issue, or how is the? Do you think they're taking it seriously enough?
I think that there are good people at every platform, and CyberWell is a trusted partner of most major social media platforms today. And we work directly with those social media platforms to empower better enforcement of their existing policies and even improving their policies to account for modern forms of anti-Semitism. So, for example, as a result of the widespread abuse of the term Zionist on social media platforms to actually spread anti-Semitism, Meta has recently updated their policy to recognize that that is a proxy term for speaking about Jews online, and so too TikTok has as well. CyberWell was involved in providing data to that decision-making process and is still providing examples to actually train the classifiers online on how to identify that information, right? So I do think that there are efforts, but typically those efforts are really focused on things that are coming too late, right? They're reacting to a crisis situation. The update is typically happening on a policy level when in fact we should be leveraging technology to implement these policies at scale more effectively. And I also want to point out when it came to the October 7th denial campaign, this is something that CyberWell has been focused on since October 7th because we saw this campaign happen and we saw that the rates of removal at the time by the social media platforms were at 9% after reporting. So far below the average of what we would expect to see. And as I mentioned, an active misinformation and disinformation campaign that very much mimics the conspiratorial thinking of of Holocaust deniers, right? Now, the thing is, the social media platforms actually had policies on the books that should have addressed this type of content. It's called violent event denial policy. It applies to not only the Holocaust, but also to the Sandy Hook school shooting, also to the Rwanda genocide. Technically speaking, it should have been really easy to look at the policy or the guidebook and say, this is violative content and we're going to remove it. But that didn't happen. It was platformed for millions of people and it fueled hate and justified radical, aggressive tactics against the Jewish community in the anti-Israel demonstrations, and it became a threat to public safety. When I was talking to some of the contacts at these major social media platforms, I was told, well, October 7th denial doesn't have any real world harm. That was the reaction from them. Okay. So, and then what happens? Literally just a couple of weeks after that conversation, there were two incidents of rape, revenge rape, anti-Semitic rape in France, both on a 12-year-old girl and on a 30-some-year-old woman who was kidnapped and raped as revenge. One of the major narratives of the October 7th denial campaign was that rape never happened during October 7th. Meanwhile, Susan Sarandon was also stopped on the street and said, that's propaganda. It never happened. So there is a real world harm to these misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And the social media platforms are relying on third-party fact checkers who have no KPIs, no quality assurance. The third-party fact checkers can literally choose what piece of content they want to fact check, and it's done on a manual level, not any kind of way at scale, not any way that's using technology to actually effectively implement these policies. So since CyberWell's work on October 7th denial, TikTok actually went on the record as being the first social media platform to recognize that October 7th denial was prohibited content. And since that decision happened, we've seen the rates of removal go up exponentially and are now at about 40%, which is closer to the average of what we would expect to see for online anti-Semitism. But it took 6 months to get there, right? And that's the problem. The social media platforms have a unique responsibility because they are the masters of these algorithmically charged machines that are spreading information, not only speech, information that also fuels hate and also fuels extremist action. And that is what we have seen since October 7th online. And we've seen that translate directly to targeting the Jewish community in different diaspora places, the United States, Europe, of course. Anti-Semitic incidents are up. increasing by 200%. Over 61% of Jews, according to the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement statistics, have experienced anti-Semitism directly since October 7th. And when we have this information about incidents, violent incidents, people being confronted with hatred, bigotry, and discrimination in places that they were otherwise safe, it kind of shocks the system. But for me, as somebody who's been looking at the way that social media platforms have been broadcasting this Jew hatred to millions of people since October 7th, it's no surprise. What's happening online is directly spilling out over into the streets and making it unsafe for Jewish communities today.
Now, of course, there's two sides, I guess you could say, to anti-Semitism online. There's the putting up actual content or incitement to violence or whatever, and then there's also perhaps covering up footage that people have, say, of anti-Semitic protests and riots in certain places to try and make, I guess, the opposition look not as bad as they actually are. Have you seen, from what you've been able to tell, much on that side of the equation as well?
Well, we definitely saw there were active efforts to cover the response, a lot of the BDS movement specifically, that was there to amplify and support the attacks of Hamas as early as October 7th. These people were organizing and amplifying and even borrowing imagery from the attack itself, including infamously the paraglider, the motorized paragliders that came in over the border in order to execute this mass terrorist attack. And that became a symbol for the BDS movement globally in order to organize protests in support of these attacks. And I think that this is going directly to another trend that we've very much seen in online spaces since October 7th, which is the normalization and platforming of pro-terror content. And again, exactly what we've seen online and the failure of the social media platforms to systematically and effectively enforce what's known as their dangerous organizations and individuals or their anti-terror policies online. We now see that in the streets. We see that by people showing up with Hezbollah flags, with Hezbollah shirts, with impunity, as you said, including Hamas, including the spokesperson of Hamas, Abu Ubaidah, which has become a popular kind of iconicized figure online. We also see this with a very clear trend of the use of the red triangle, which is used as it's a target symbol coming directly from Hamas propaganda to identify where there is a Israeli or a Jewish target, a casualty, a future casualty from their propaganda videos. This red triangle directly from Hamas terror propaganda has now been normalized and is being used widespread in online spaces and also in the anti-Israel encampments and riots. And that has now turned into literally bringing in threats for domestic terrorism. In opposition to Bibi's Netanyahu's speech in Washington, D.C. some months ago, the red triangle was spray painted in Union Station with the threat, Hamas is coming. The same red triangle has been vandalized numerous times in different Jewish communities, including the Squirrel Hill Jewish community that was targeted in the Tree of Life shooting. So this symbol, because of social media platforms, has now jumped from very secluded pro-terror propaganda channels to our mainstream everyday social media platforms and is now being used actively, domestically, by these protesters to threaten domestic terrorism. And where is the government interest saying, what are you doing about the red triangle? What are you doing about Hezbollah symbols? What are you doing about Hamas symbols online, right? Everything that we're seeing in the streets, you could see a precursor to it being normalized and platformed on the major social media platforms.
You mentioned earlier comparisons with what's going on now and some of the information war immediately before the Holocaust. Now, obviously, that was very organized and coordinated. Do you see, whether it's through organizations or even state actors, kind of similar coordination, or would you say this is mostly grassroots?
It's a fantastic question. As you said, during the Third Reich, and I think Deborah Lipstadt, who's the ambassador for combating anti-Semitism in the United States, said this the best. The difference between what we see in anti-Semitism today versus the Third Reich is that that was state-sponsored anti-Semitism, including in the forms of mass communication. Today, what you see is algorithmically charged anti-Semitism on the mainstream social media platforms. And the people who are organizing the abuse of our social media platforms are both organizations that have foreign funding and also the countries themselves. As I mentioned, CyberWell's primary focus following October 7th has been looking and examining the October 7th denial campaign online. There were multiple indicators that there was inauthentic behavior, meaning the amplification of bots. Suddenly, somebody with only a few thousand followers gets October 7th denial content tweeted out regularly on their account. Now they're getting millions of views on one tweet, right? That's a big indicator for inauthentic behavior. So I'll say that what we can say for sure is that the anti-Semitism today is algorithmically charged anti-Semitism. The people who are abusing our algorithmic machines are without a doubt both organizations and foreign state actors. The question then becomes, what is the responsibility of the social media platforms, and what is the responsibility of the governments of the Western democracies who love free speech but can see that the writing is on the wall in terms of the abuse of these platforms for normalizing pro-terror content, normalizing hate content that leads very much to targeting of their communities, and misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are meant and are designed to sow unrest, destruction, and destabilize a society. The problem is that the government feels like they can't step in here, but they absolutely can. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface on different solutions that we have here in our legislational arsenal. People talk about the fact that Section 230 is a sinkhole. In fact, it is. It's been tried to be reformed in the United States about 20 odd times in the last 2 years, and Congress has failed to do any reform around Section 230. But there are multiple other legislational solutions that we can borrow from that are focused on transparency, that are focused on regulating, just like you would regulate how quickly a stock is traded on the market, right? There are limitations to that in order to prevent price manipulation. Same thing can happen when it comes to content virality. So this is a moment a year after October 7th, not only to examine the horrific attack, but look at the way that our mainstream social media platforms, our favorite apps, were abused by a terror organization, and ask ourselves, what should we be doing to make sure that doesn't happen again?
With that, I mean, obviously, there's even before October 7th happened, quite a few, I guess you could say, perennial sources of this kind of disinformation that wouldn't be too surprising, like the BDS movement you just mentioned, or like news organizations like Al Jazeera. With everything that's gone on with October 7th, with the new spotlight that Israel has, with the new, I guess you could say, impetus a lot of people in high places have to comment on this or to involve themselves in Israel's war effort. Has your research found any surprising sources of this kind of disinformation that we wouldn't have expected otherwise?
Well, I personally wouldn't have expected for Al Jazeera to be one of the main trumpets of the October 7th denial campaign. October 7th denial is today's modern form of Holocaust denial. The major narratives claim that rape and sexual violence didn't happen, claim that Israel actually orchestrated the attack or that they were behind the attack. Why? Because ultimately they're profiting from it. And Al Jazeera, which is one of the most influential news sources in the Middle East, if not in the world, actually tweeted out on the Al Jazeera Arabic account when Israel did something unprecedented and released the picture of two small children who were burnt alive by Hamas. They tweeted out that that was an AI generated image. Okay, so there is not only a lack of accountability and a lack of clarity on what do we expect from social media platforms in this, but what do we expect from our traditional media platforms, traditional media outlets for tweeting out this type of misinformation and disinformation. So absolutely, that is an issue that we have seen. Obviously, it was very surprising to see, specifically with the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital explosion, that because of social media, quite literally, was wrongfully attributed to Israel, and it turned out that that was a misfire from a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket are major news sources because of the race to the bottom with being first with the story. Incorrectly also in their major headlines attributed that to Israel. And what was interesting to see is when that happened, when the New York Times falsely put out that headline along with other major news sources, we saw online that that triggered a spike in online anti-Semitism. Hashtag Hitler was right trended, spiking upwards on Twitter right after that that misinformation incident, and specifically in Arabic, it had increased by 29,000%. So the weight and the power of misinformation and disinformation and the way that it's spreading in an active conflict via the social media platforms is very much part of triggering anti-Semitism, both online and offline.
And what do you would say be the end game if this is coordinated? If there are people investing lots of money, lots of time, lots of resources into getting this going, it's obviously a lot more than just like hate-filled random people here and there venting their thoughts. Is it to pressure governments to do more to marginalize Israel, or is it just to sow terror, pure and simple, or is there any other motivation?
Well, I want to stick to my expertise, which is online anti-Semitism. Absolutely, Ron has said very openly with the export of very radical Islamic jihad to the world, that part of that campaign is to delegitimize Israel. And that has been the goal of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, since day one. I think that it's up to the Western democracies who respect free speech and respect concerns about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Those concerns are legitimate concerns. Bringing attention to those concerns is fine. And I'm saying that as an Israeli, right? But when you're platforming and you're celebrating genocidal attacks by a terror organization, not only has the BDS movement and those who are following it lost the plot, it's now up to Western democracies to understand that this is a national security threat for their countries and to make it very clear what their plans are for dealing with those people. Even the arrests that have been made in the anti-Israel encampments, I think over 50% of them have resulted in no action. Okay. So why? If these people are literally supporting a pro-terror movement, that's a national security concern for the United States, but we cannot ignore the role that social media platforms are playing in platforming and broadcasting this pro-terror content, misinformation, and hate speech that is ultimately activating these groups.
Of course, it's also one thing for bots or whoever to put this kind of content out there or to artificially inflate the numbers, but has your statistics been able to ascertain if they've actually been having a desired effect, if there's a lot of people that maybe ordinarily wouldn't be believing this kind of material falling in line, etc.?
So it's hard to measure because that's very bespoke to somebody's algorithmic feed. But I can tell you that even if something is being falsely amplified by millions of views or millions of clicks, even if that's done by a bot, it ultimately is hijacking the algorithm, and it's going to increase the likelihood that somebody will be exposed to that misinformation and disinformation. And I mentioned the October 7th denial major narratives. If you stop anyone who is at a anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian rally and you talk to them about rape or sexual violence that was used on October 7th, they will tell you it didn't happen. Now, they truly believe that because that is what was shown to them on social media. It's important to understand most people under 30 years old are using social media platforms as their primary news source, as their primary news source. Now, the law has failed to hold social media platforms to account like a publisher, but objectively speaking, socially, that's how people are looking at these platforms, as publishers, as their main news source. By the way, the number one news source for most people under 30 years old, if they are citing social media, is Twitter. But TikTok has doubled in the last 2 years. And when you look at TikTok, you have something that's a very aggressive, confirmation bias algorithm that was meant originally as ByteDance to keep you engaged, to show you a song, to entertain you. Well, now it's become a platform of citizen journalism. Has any kind of adjustment being done to the algorithm? Absolutely not. So, what is it doing? It's continuously engaging you in things that are going to confirm your bias or confirm the way you interact with an algorithm. It's meant to entertain, not to inform. And yet, objectively speaking, it's being used by people as a news source. So it just heightens how urgent and important this issue is, and how this is no longer an issue of just online anti Semitism or how the platforms were used to promote anti Jewish stuff. This is a national security issue, and it needs to be treated as such.
Okay, that's about all the material I had. Is there anything from your perspective that you think people out there in cyberspace aren't too aware of that they think they should know?
Yes, when we're looking at the situation of online anti-Semitism, I can share with you, we do a very clear narrative analysis. So we're not only tracking, anti-Semitism, what does that mean? I can share with you that prior to October 7th, the majority or the leading narrative that we saw in the online space were tropes about Jewish power, world domination and control, kind of classic anti-Semitic tropes. That was the leading trope that we saw online. Since October 7th, we've seen a very clear trend to overtly hostile anti Semitic narratives characterizing Jews as the enemy and characterizing Jews as evil. And this is an escalation in terms of the way that people are thinking about the Jewish people. People are thinking hostilely about the Jewish people as something that is inherently evil and inherently an enemy that must be fought and that must be defeated. This is when we talk about the concern of the power of words in online spaces that are being shared for millions of people. It's no longer an anti Semitism that's rooted in disdain, it's rooted in almost pseudo religious, open hostility and belief that Jews are evil. And you asked a great question about how likely is it that this content is being effective on people? I can tell you it's being effective on Jews, right? For the majority of Jewish Americans, well over 60% of them that experienced online anti-Semitism in the last 12 months, 1 in 3 of those users, those Jewish users that experienced online anti-Semitism, will take active steps to hide their identity, both online or offline. And this has been reflective also in recent surveys released by CAM that about 1/3 of Jews are now taking steps to actively hide their identity. That is the indicator and the litmus test on, is the online anti-Semitism really effective? Is it that big of a deal? The answer is absolutely. Not only do we see that in the massive increase of anti-Semitic incidents, but also from the experience of Jewish people themselves who are now hiding their identity, who are now doing things like opening multiple accounts, one that doesn't show their identity whatsoever, and even leaving social media altogether. This is a major cause for concern, clearly for the Jewish community, but also from a national security perspective, and it requires a vigilant inquiry into what the social media platforms are doing 1 year after October 7th.
Tal-Or Cohen Montemayor, thank you for coming here.
Thank you so much.